we are pleased to present the Degree Committee. The Head of Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage, Professor Luigi Perissinotto. Professor Roberta Dreon. Professor Giuseppe Goisis. Professor Daniele Goldoni. Professor Umberto Margiotta. Professor Eleonora Montuschi. Professor Gianluigi Paltrinieri. Professor Cecilia Rofena. And Professor Luigi Tarca. We now invite the Rector, Professor Carlo Carraro, onto the stage.
Good morning. Good morning and welcome to all of you. I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm always at many ceremonies and conferences and meetings, but this one is really an important one for University of Venice, for University Ca' Foscari. I'm really happy to be here to introduce this ceremony. It's important because 3 years ago we changed the way in which honorary degree, the laurea honoris causa, the most important of our honorary degrees, is being awarded. In the past, it was given to sponsors of the university, personalities that probably had little to do with research, knowledge, and academia, and more to do with business. This is over. 3 years ago, I proposed the Senate, and the Senate of this university decided that the laurea honoris causa was going to be delivered, awarded only to outstanding personalities in the fields in which Ca' Foscari has become an excellent university. And in these years, in these last 4 years indeed, only 3 of them, and this is the fourth one, one per year has been awarded. I recall that the first one was awarded to Joe Stiglitz, then Philip Laird Johnson, and then Paul Crutzen, 2 of them Nobel Prize winners. And this year, we have a fourth one to another outstanding personality, another outstanding scholar, one of the best in his field, certainly a Nobel Prize winner, if in the case should a Nobel Prize in philosophy exist. It does not for the moment, maybe it will come in the future, but certainly his role in the field of philosophy, his contributions, what he wrote, books and articles, show that he's one of the leading personalities in the field. I'm really delighted to be here today to award the laurea honoris causa to such an important person. And a contributor is a scholar that continues the tradition, Ca' Foscari tradition, to award the laurea honoris causa to really the most important scholar personality in the field that has been chosen. And the decision has been taken not just because of the scientific contribution and the cultural contribution, but because of the capacity, the ability of the person, of the colleague that has been awarded to contribute in many other fields, in many other roles, and not just as a scholar, and in addition, for the collaboration, cooperation with our university. This is also another important dimension, another important criterion which has been used to take this decision. So I don't want to spend many words because better than what I can do in a few minutes, Professor Perissinotto, the head of the Department of Philosophy, will explain the decisions that led his department to propose the laurea honoris degree to Professor Patman. But I believe that the university as a whole, the Senate, when approved the decision, the proposal of the department, and the ministry, because the process is quite complicated. As you probably know that the proposal comes from the department, and the Senate of this university sent the proposal to the National Advisory Board that the ministry adopts, utilizes to get an advice on the proposal, and then the final decision is taken by the minister. So the process is long and complicated, but at least it shows not only the bureaucracy of this country, but also the quality control, the capacity to check step by step what the content, the quality of the initial proposal. So in a few minutes, Professor Perinotto will explain better what I can do, the value, the importance of this decision. And after Professor Perinotto, Professor Davidson, who is a visiting professor this year at Ca' Foscari, will deliver his laudatio. I'm really happy to have Professor Davidson here for the laudatio because this is another indicator of the quality of Ca' Foscari and the capacity of Ca' Foscari to attract outstanding scholars from all over the world. But let me stop here. Let me thank all of you for being here today. Let me thank all colleagues from the department represented by the committee here in this ceremony. Let me thank the Senate and all the colleagues of the university, and in particular, let me thank Professor Patman because really his role in so many years and his collaboration, his cooperation with some of the colleagues of the department, and in particular, his contributions to global knowledge worldwide have really been outstanding. I'm really happy and delighted to be here for the ceremony to award him the laurea honoris causa degree from Ca' Foscari University. Thank you all, and let's start with the ceremony by asking Professor Perissinotto to introduce Professor Patman. Thank you.
The motivation for conferring the laurea honoris causa on Professor Patman. The laurea honoris causa in philosophy is conferred on Professor Patman for the fundamental contribution to philosophy, for the vastness of his fields of research, logic, philosophy of language, of mind, of science, of mathematics, ethics, ontology, metaphilosophy, for his profound analytical abilities and the originality of his theoretical construction, and for having always connected specialized research with the problem of human existence. Thank you.
Sono americano, quindi comincio in italiano. Magnifico rettore, egregi colleghi, gentili studenti, carissimo Hilary Patman. Sono commosso dall'onore di pronunciare questo laudatio. Devo subito dirvi che per me Hilary Patman non è soltanto un grandissimo filosofo, ma anche il mio maestro, poi un collega e un amico. La laudatio è indirizzata a voi e allo stesso tempo a Hilary Patman. La pronuncio in inglese. I do not believe that it falls within the competence of philosophers to make predictions about the future. So you will have to forgive me if I begin by making a prediction. When historians of philosophy attempt to write the history of contemporary philosophy, they will not know how to classify Hilary Patman. If they begin by examining his early work, they will discover a philosopher who made definitive contributions to logic and the foundations of mathematics, as well as to the philosophy of science, of mathematics and logic. All areas of philosophy that require a highly specialized technical knowledge. As they continue reading, they will encounter Putnam's equally important contributions to the philosophy of language, of mind, and of cognitive science. And they will certainly come to the conclusion that no other post-World War II philosopher made so deep an impact on the way in which problems concerning philosophy in an age of science, to use the title of his last book, came to be formulated, discussed, and re-elaborated in the history of analytic philosophy. At this very moment, just as they have begun to find a way to classify Hilary Putnam's contribution to philosophy, they will be met by intellectual perplexity and disorientation. They will have already recognized that unlike many philosophers in the tradition of analytic philosophy, Hilary Putnam's writings are permeated by references to the history of philosophy, in constant dialogue with Aristotle, Descartes, Hume and Kant, John Stuart Mill and John Dewey, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Perhaps they will think of this as a mere idiosyncrasy on the part of Putnam, a taste for history, as well as an interest in science. In fact, these historical interests are not superficial and should not be underestimated. They reflect Putnam's very ideal of what it means to be a philosopher, an ideal that will come more powerfully into focus as these historians of philosophy continue to study Putnam's work. They will be confronted by detailed and profound contributions to areas of philosophy that are hardly ever even touched on by most philosophers of science and mathematics. Moral and political philosophy, aesthetics and the philosophy of literature, the philosophy of religion. Here too, Hilary Putnam's writings have refashioned how a wide range of problems are approached. The ways in which the pervasive and supposedly clear distinction between facts and values has infiltrated virtually all dimensions of our thinking have to be completely re-examined in light of Putnam's criticisms of this rigid fact-value distinction, of his demonstrations of the many entanglements between facts and values. How we understand religious experience and its role in our everyday life, our unrelenting philosophical demand for a theory of religious knowledge instead of a certain way of life, can no longer be seen in the same way after reading Putnam. The value of literature and art as a source of knowledge about ourselves, about others, and about the world is as present in Hilary Putnam's work as is the value of quantum mechanics and set theory. Who is this Hilary Putnam? We move from a discussion of Henry James to an engagement with Kurt Gödel in the span of a few pages. He is quite simply someone who knows that philosophy, like all disciplines, requires specialized knowledge, but who fights against the idea that philosophy itself is a form of specialization. However, this is only the beginning of Hilary Putnam's unclassifiability. It is well known to all philosophers, including Hilary Putnam himself, that Putnam is typically characterized as the philosopher who is always changing his mind. No one has been a more penetrating critic of Hilary Putnam's views that have been widely accepted in contemporary philosophy, than Hilary Putnam. Hilary Putnam's famous changes of mind all have one feature in common. They are motivated by finding new arguments, new perspectives, alternatives, new problems that other philosophers have failed to see because they believe that Putnam has already definitively resolved the relevant philosophical issue, and that therefore there's nothing more to think about, and they can move on to a new issue. Thus, these other philosophers become committed Putnamians. Hilary Putnam is decisively not a Putnamian. What others take to be fixed, definitive solutions, and what then becomes for them a dogma of philosophy, is always for Hilary Putnam himself a point of departure for further philosophical investigation. Personally, I hope that Hilary Putnam continues to change his mind. Rather than exhibiting philosophical instability, these changes show what it means to continue to think philosophically about problems. Problems of science and mathematics, of ethics, politics, and religion, of human life. When Hilary Putnam stops changing his mind, we will all be worse off, philosophically poorer, since we will be deprived of unforeseen arguments, intuitions, and perspectives of new sources of philosophical creativity. Indeed, Hilary Putnam's extraordinary analytical abilities are so evident that it is all too easy to overlook his equally powerful philosophical imagination. Moreover, Hilary Putnam's mode of changing his mind also gives voice to a constant ethical trait of his character, his anti-dogmatism, his incessant search for further impartiality and objectivity. Hilary Putnam exemplifies an attitude beautifully described by the great historian of ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot, a philosopher dear to both Hilary and to me. Discussing scientific objectivity and spiritual exercises, Hadot writes, and I quote, "From Aristotle on, it has been acknowledged that science must be disinterested. Whoever studies a text, or microbes, or the stars, has to free himself from his subjectivity. Some will say it is impossible, but I think that what is at stake, nevertheless, is an ideal that one needs to attempt to reach through a certain practice. Thus, those scholars who have the rare courage to recognize that they are mistaken in a particular case, or who try not to let themselves be influenced by their own personal prejudices, undertake a spiritual exercise of detachment from themselves. I believe," says Hadot, "that objectivity is a virtue and moreover very arduous to practice. One has to free oneself from the partiality of one's individual and passionate ego in order to elevate oneself to the universality of the rational self. I have always thought that the exercise of democratic politics, as it should be practiced, must itself also correspond to this attitude. Detachment from oneself is a moral attitude that should be required of the politician as well as of the scholar." End of quotation. Hilary Putnam's changes of mind are but the external aspect of his moral and intellectual courage, his quest for objectivity. Speaking of Pierre Hadot, I am also reminded of his insistence that Socrates himself was often described as unclassifiable, atopos. The very disorientation provoked by this unclassifiability, whether ancient or modern, stems from the never-ending, never-dormant, rigorous philosophical dialectic practiced by Hilary Putnam in his writings, just as it derived from the philosophical vigilance and attention, the lack of self-complacency practiced by Socrates in his dialogues. Socrates never retired, and neither has Hilary Putnam. Hilary Putnam has received, to be sure, many honors in his distinguished and still extraordinarily active philosophical career. In preparing this laudatio, I was very surprised to discover that in the list of the many countries that have conferred on him an honorary degree, we do not find Italy. This is all the more surprising since Putnam's work has been deeply present and influential among Italian philosophers, and for a very long time. Indeed, it is not rare to find that the first foreign translation of a new Hilary Putnam book is its translation into Italian. Perhaps he has not yet received an honorary degree in Italy because it was thought by everyone that he must have already received so many of them. Whatever the explanation for this omission, it has created a situation of philosophical, cultural, and historical injustice. Thanks to the vision of the rector, Carlo Carraro, who's transforming Ca' Foscari into a truly international university, and thanks to the wisdom of my colleagues in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage and our director, Luigi Perisonotto, I stand before you today with great joy to participate in the rectification of this injustice. Let me conclude my laudatio with this thought. As members of a university community, we repeatedly say that we are committed to the life of reason. Yet concretely, we do not always know what these words mean. I submit to you that if you want to understand concretely and in depth what it means to be committed to the life of reason, there is no better place to start than by reading Hilary Putnam.
Philosophy of Society, Art, and Communication to Hilary Putnam. We invite Professor Putnam to come up to the stage.
Wait a couple of minutes. Professor Putnam needs to get ready. I'm really pleased and happy about what is going to happen in a few seconds. What will happen afterwards will be even better. I was supposed to have another one, but doesn't matter. Because the lecture magistrale that Professor Putnam will deliver right after the ceremony will be the most important event inside this event. I really appreciate what Professor Davidson just said. Also noticed when he was talking that there is a close relation between the four honorary degrees that we awarded, the fourth one in the last 5 years, because I checked the dates, and the close link is that there is a common denominator among the four colleagues that have been awarded, all have been professors at Princeton University for quite a long while, and Professor Putnam received his tenure in both philosophy and in both the Department of Philosophy and the Department of Mathematics at Princeton University. So there is a common denominator of which I'm quite pleased, even though there is no relation with what I did myself in the past. So let's move to this important ceremony, and I will invite Professor Putnam.
Dr. Hilary Putnam will now give his Lectio Magistralis entitled Reason as a Value.
It's obviously too late to say senza far complimenti. Dear friend, former student, and Davidson, all of you. It's an enormous honor to receive an honorary doctorate from so ancient and distinguished a university as Università Ca' Foscari, in the very country that gave birth to the European Renaissance, and more particularly gave birth to Renaissance humanism, the tradition to which the modern ideas of toleration and of universal values owe so much. Daniel, you may disagree, but as subjects for the lezione I've been asked to give on this occasion, I've chosen a notion that was at the very center of Renaissance humanism, the notion of reason. I shall talk about the severe criticisms that notion has encountered over the last few centuries, and then close by saying why I think those criticisms, in spite of the elements of truth some of them contain, should not lead us to abandon the notion, but should rather lead us to continued reflection on what reason is and what it demands of us. I shall focus on the empiricist critics, who were historically the most influential. In the Middle Ages, reason was usually identified as the idea that first philosophy in general, prima philosophia, and ethics in particular, have a priori foundations. This was also thought to be the view of the great classical philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, though I myself read both of them as seeing greater differences between the different sorts of necessary truths than did their medieval successors. Philosophers in the empiricist tradition have been powerful critics of the attempt to ground morality or religion or metaphysics on supposed a priori truths. And the most famous example of such criticism is, of course, to be found in the writings of David Hume. If the word reason is taken to refer to a priori reasoning, then little remains of the very idea of reason in that sense after Hume. If we are supposed to know exactly what a priori means, and by virtue of that knowledge, to know that there are certain truths, the a priori ones, that science could never discover to need rejection or restriction, and to understand, moreover, why such truths can never need rejection or restriction, then I must confess to be skeptical about that supposition. In that sense, I am, like Hume, a mitigated skeptic. Hume, however, does believe that there is such a thing as reason, although he holds a drastically restrictive view of what it can do. For example, Hume knows that most people take it as obvious that reason can tell one whether one of one's ideas resembles an external state of affairs that one perceives. Yet Hume tells one that while ideas can resemble impressions, sense impressions, we have no idea what causes impressions, and sometimes he states more carefully that it makes no sense to think that something that is not an impression could ever cause an impression. For a long time, I read Hume as telling us not just that reason cannot tell one that there is any external world at all, but that in the study, that is, considering the arguments pursued purely logically, he finds Berkeley's arguments to the effect that we don't have so much as a coherent idea of an external object completely convincing. However, Mark Steiner points out in his introduction to his forthcoming Hebrew translation of Hume's treatise on human nature that this is a misinterpretation of Hume's views. In Hume's view, there is a notion of an external object that Berkeley didn't think of. This is the unperceived perception, that is, an impression that is not connected to any mind. Such an object would not be an instance of a Lockean notion of matter at all. Of course, Berkeley would not accept the notion of an unperceived perception, since for him it is an a priori truth that all perceptions are in the mind. As Steiner points out, the existence of external objects in this sense, perceptions not in any mind, or what G. Moore called unsensed sensibilia, is coherent for Hume as it is consistent with his non-Berkeleian bundle theory of the mind. The mind is just a bundle of impressions, then there may be some impressions left over which are not bundled up in any bundle. However, Hume offers an empirical argument to support his conclusion that in fact there are no perceptions not in any mind. This argument is based on what Hume called experiments, in a rather non-contemporary sense of experiment, in double vision and other phenomena, to show that all sense impressions are causally connected to events in the body and nervous system, i.e. impressions, and of course the body and the nervous system are themselves just impressions that are another part of the bundle we call the mind, and are therefore themselves part of the mind. To sum up, there are two different notions of external object for Hume. According to these different uses, the proposition, there are unobserved bodies, is incoherent, that is the Berkeleian notion of unperceived body, or false. The sense in which it's false has to do with the persistence of impressions when not in a mind, not with the existence of material objects that are not even candidates to be in a mind. True, as in my lifetime both Peter Strawson and Barry Stroud have stressed, Hume also famously tells us that the incoherence or falsity he discovers in the idea of the existence of unobserved bodies can be ignored because we are psychologically incapable of believing it. But that seems to be to say that reason cannot tell us that an idea agrees with what we think we perceive, because we think we perceive independently existing objects. And Hume has argued that the notion of an independently existing object is either incoherent or false. However, don't worry, Hume says, because you don't have to worry about that, because we're incapable of believing that this is the case. This is true, but we'll ignore it because we're incapable of believing it. Or if we can believe it, or if it can be the case that reason can tell us that there are external objects, then there's a different use of the word reason altogether, and also a different use of external object. Again, when people write about Hume's ethical theories, they often tell us that according to those theories, reason can tell us how to act so as to successfully attain certain ends, reach certain goals, but reason cannot tell us what ends to select. Peirce's deep criticism of this argument is unfortunately almost universally neglected. But knowledge of what acts will have what results is inductive knowledge, according to Hume. And when people write about human induction, they tell us that according to him, reason cannot justify inductive conclusions. Well, how can reason tell us what ends to select? I mean, what ends will have, what means will reach what ends. To this, Nelson Goodman famously added that neither Hume nor anyone else has ever told us exactly what is and what is not a legitimate inductive inference. The most plausible reconciliation of these views is when Hume says reason can tell us some things about specifically the things we think we observe. I don't believe, by the way, that he would have allowed inferences to unobservable things, such as subatomic particles at all, and can tell us some things about what will happen in the future. He means by reason what he sometimes calls reasonableness. In one place Hume says that reason cannot show that the sun will rise tomorrow morning, but it will be most unreasonable to doubt it. And that's the positive notion of reason in Hume, and not the a priori reasoning of the metaphysicians that he attacks. But what is reasonableness? Leaving aside the question of knowledge by observation for the moment, to return to it later, we find empiricists of a Humean bent assuming for 200 years that everyone knows what modes of reasoning induction includes, until Hans Reichenbach and Rudolf Carnap tried in different ways to formalize the notion with obviously unsuccessful results. But that was after World War II. But just slightly before World War II. But already in the 19th century, William Whewell saw that empirical inference, which which he continued to call induction while enormously broadening the notion, is not simply a matter of observing the frequency with which something happens, on the one hand, or simply observing that some consequences of a hypothesis are verified by observation, on the other. As Whewell pointed out, theories have to meet not just the criterion of leading to good predictions, but also have to be judged for coherence and for consilience with our developing scientific picture. This was the first major step in the development of a conception of science that stressed the role of epistemic values in science. For make no mistake about it, coherence and consilience are values, as well as the role of informed theory construction, even in the importance of informed theory construction at the discovery stage, a role that is still underappreciated in philosophy of science. At the same time, the empiricist limitation of science to observables, a limitation inherited by logical positivism in its early decades, was scrapped by Whewell. Unfortunately, it had to wait for 20th century philosophers and historians of science to rediscover Whewell's work. It should have become obvious from that work that, quotes, we know what good reasoning about empirical matters is, it's just induction, was either extremely vague or simply false. The empiricists indeed shook our faith in one notion of reason, the notion of a human faculty that enables us to arrive at apodictic truths. And it was a real contribution to shake our faith in that notion, because the revolutionary advances of science in the past few centuries obviously depended on the growth of fallibilism. But empiricism did not give us a usable positive notion of reason or of reasonableness. Moreover, although epistemologists often write as if observation reports were simply given, anyone who spent time in a law court or a laboratory knows that this is a fantastic oversimplification. Virtually all observations are already past observations by the time a scientist comes to write a paper for a scientific journal. And anyone who has spent time in a laboratory, or even had occasion to attend a trial, knows that past observations are controversial. Both scientists and laymen disagree about what was observed, and the selection of observations to count as even minimally credible depends on judgments of coherence, just as selection of theories to count as even worth testing does. It is because he thought that in epistemology, all observations could be reduced to introspective observations of one's own sensations, and because he simply refused to worry about the reliability of memory, that Hume could ignore this. The right interpretation of Hume's views on ethics is perhaps even more in dispute than that of his views on empirical inquiry. The problem is simple. On the one hand, Hume famously tells us that one cannot infer an ought from an is, which I take in company with many interpreters to mean that ought statements do not state facts. Since in general they purport to state something other than relations of ideas, it seems to follow that ought statements and values judgments do not state anything that one could argue about. They simply express our passions. On the other hand, Hume wrote a treatise on ethics, his inquiry concerning the principles of morals. So, how do we reconcile the Hume that says that value judgments don't state facts, don't state anything that you can argue about, they express your passions, and the Hume that wrote a treatise on morals? The most plausible reconciliation is to say that although on Hume's view, reason, not just apodictic reason, but this time even inductive reasoning, cannot tell us what ends to choose. Nevertheless, in some sense of reasonable, there's a difference between reasonable and unreasonable ends. Well, what does that difference consist in? There have been various interpretations of his text. For example, that Hume thought reasonable ends are the ones that would be approved of by an ideal and disinterested observer. But my interest is not in Hume interpretation per se, but in the course of the empiricist critique of reason after him. And ideal observer theory was not popular among 19th or 20th century empiricists. What was popular was utilitarianism. Just as reasonable empirical views came to be identified with what by induction, and this introduction, so reasonable or at any rate desirable moral views came to be identified by leading empiricists with utilitarian views. But why are utilitarian views reasonable? From his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, it's clear that the father of the most influential version of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, thought, one, that all human beings, insofar as they proceed by rational deliberation, aim at achieving what is in their own interest, either individually or collectively, and hence, two, any reasoning that appeals to considerations other than utility, aka pleasure or even happiness, must do so by appealing to irrational feelings and modes of thought. Since in modern democratic states, legislation is, ideally at least, enacted by representatives of the whole-bodied public, it follows, according to Bentham, that only when the legislators are utilitarians will they do what they're elected to do, namely determine by rational argument what maximizes utility. In sum, only utilitarians can be rational decision makers. Bentham's great successor, John Stuart Mill, accepted this argument, but undercut it by denying that there's a simple mathematical measure of utility or general happiness. This, as Whewell, kept the term induction, but made induction a matter of judgment, a matter of weighing such imponderable values as coherence and consilience. So Mill kept the term utility, but made utility a matter of weighing such imponderable values as the, quotes, higher pleasures of the mind, unquotes, against the lower pleasures of the body. Moreover, the utilitarian idea that the right course of action is the one that maximizes pleasure, however broadly that term be construed, clashes with the Kantian intuition, which I share, that some things, deliberately giving false testimony so that a tyrant will be able to sentence an innocent person to be executed, was Kant's example, some things are wrong even if they're done to bring about a general happiness in the future. My view is that utility is only one of a number of desiderata in moral and political reasoning, and it by no means trumps other desiderata such as justice. The common element in these empiricist attempts at describing reason, or better reasonableness, is that they are scientistic. Induction was thought of, even in the 20th century by Reichenbach and Carnap, to be an algorithm, a computer program, which, given observations, or more precisely observation reports, assigns a number, a probability measure, to predictions of future observation reports, and also in Reichenbach's case assigns a number to theories. Rational decision-making was thought of as calculation of estimated utilities, given a utility function or later a preference ordering. It is not surprising that these unworkable and hideously oversimplified accounts of reasoning in science and in ethics were abandoned by most philosophers by the end of the 20th century. But what is the alternative? When I said at the beginning of this talk that I discussed the severe criticisms that the notion of reason has encountered in recent centuries, some of you may have expected me to discuss deconstruction rather than empiricism. If I discussed empiricism instead, it is because it was and remains a serious intellectual movement, one created by geniuses and defended by geniuses, however mistaken some of its tenets turn out to be. Deconstruction, in contrast, was so riddled with exaggerations. For example, all language aspires to be writing and not speech. There's nothing meaningful to be said about a reality outside the text, etc., etc., etc. But it's not so surprising that its 15 minutes of world fame, in Andy Warhol's famous phrase, have already passed. But it was a symptom of deconstruction was a symptom of two important facts about our culture. The first, which I pointed out long ago in an essay titled Convention, a Theme in Philosophy, is that a term constantly associated with deconstruction, namely postmodernism, is interesting, precisely because there was nothing genuinely postmodern about it. There was nothing genuinely postmodern about any of the movements associated with that term, including deconstruction. It's true that the postmodernists were not modernists in the sense represented by T.S. Eliot, who they like to hold up as a great example of modernism. But Eliot ignored surrealism, Dadaism, Marxism, and many other currents of modernism whose affinity with what came to be called postmodernism is quite evident. The fact is that we yearn for a genuine postmodernism, for something after modernism, but we have no idea what it is we yearn for. And secondly, and this is what I want to focus on in conclusion, there's something that both 20th century empiricism, logical empiricism, or logical positivism, as it came to be called, shared with deconstruction. The idea that good judgment is just a rhetorical notion, an appeal to something disreputable. Our culture distrusts the very ideas of reason and good judgment, but the expressions of that distrust take very different forms. The logical positivists, and not only logical positivists, but other philosophers of science as well, tried to show that in science at least, good judgment could be reduced to an algorithm, a computer program, an idea already anticipated in the empiricist search for rules of induction. The deconstructionist concluded that talk of good judgment is just a repressive gesture, a capitalist plot, so to speak. It's a strange fact about philosophy that while subtle and perceptive criticisms of any particular idea or movement are praised, as indeed they should be, to point out that an idea is obviously self-refuting is regarded as not playing the game. The logical empiricists claim that empirically untestable propositions are nonsense, unless they are tautologies, was obviously not empirically testable and not a tautology. So it should have been nonsense by its own criterion. But philosophers of this day, even ones critical of logical positivism, do not like it when one points this out. Wittgenstein's claim that metaphysical senses are nonsensical likely employs an extraordinary, and I believe indefensible use of the notion of nonsense. But again, one isn't supposed to point this out. Also, Alan Sokal's brilliant hoax showed just how absurd deconstruction is when taken seriously. But that too was widely regarded as below the belt. But it is important to be aware of how self-refuting all these attempts to deny the existence of a notion of reason, or to use Kant's beautiful term, a notion of mother-wit, feminist term. Kant used these two terms, good human understanding, which are mentioned for Verstand, and mother-wit, how self-refuting it is to deny that there is a notion of reason or mother-wit that transcends formalization without being either cognitively empty or just a matter of a language game. How self-refuting that is. But to the question, all right, if there is such a thing as good reason, what are the criteria for good judgment? The answer, also given by Kant, is that to the extent that there are criteria, they require good judgment to apply and to interpret. Reason is not reducible to a set of algorithms. And to the inevitable question, who is to decide when we disagree about what is reasonable? The answer is that it's because there is no algorithmic decision procedure that we need democratic and fallibilistic inquiry. And that means persisting in the struggle against the intolerance, exploitation, and injustice that always and everywhere try to subvert and corrupt democracy. Democracy is no guarantee of reason and good judgment in normative matters, but as that unlikely pair, John Dewey and Winston Churchill, said, that's the best we've got.
coming to a closure to this beautiful ceremony. On behalf of the department, of the Magnifico Rettore, of the University of Ca' Foscari, we'd like to thank you for being here with us today. We hope you enjoyed the occasion as much as we did. We hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Venice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The honorary degree ceremony is now officially closed. We would like to take this opportunity to congratulate our newest graduate, Dr. Putnam, and thank all of you for your presence here today.